Thank you so much. Thank you, Sanders, and thank you all for coming. I know that other writers come here, and maybe they all say the same thing. I've actually watched a few of these talks online, but I often visit bookstores or libraries and talk about my books, but it's very unusual to have a daytime event and it to be essentially in an office. And I think even like if someone's like, it's 7 p.m. on a Tuesday night, and do they have this sort of motivation to go to a bookstore? And I think sometimes it can be a struggle to get out of the house, but I can only imagine if you're actually in your office, like, on some kind of deadline or something, so I appreciate it. I have like one Google story, which is, this is about how I could have changed the fate of either Google or human history. I graduated from Stanford in 1997, and like all, intelligent young people at the time, I thought that it would be a very lucrative and stable thing to go into the field of writing, if as one did then. And I had no idea. I was an English major, so I feel like I sort of heard of, these search engines that were like popping up. Yahoo had formed on campus and Google had formed on campus. Although I'm not even sure of the exact timing and chronology, but I worked for the Stanford Daily, the student newspaper, and I was was an editor and writer for the feature section and the arts and entertainment section. But one evening in the spring of 1997, sort of in a pinch, they needed a copy editor. So I was reading, like it was almost like, I can't remember if it was before or after the section editor had read the article. And I think I need to actually find this because it'd be interesting to go back. But an undergrad, I think I was a senior, an undergrad had turned in an article. And I believe it was describing this sort of, I think that officially, I looked this up today, that the domain name for Google was registered in September 1997, so that hadn't even happened yet, so I'm not even sure what it was being called, but there was this article where it kept saying, like, this search engine, and I remember saying to the writer, I think search engine is a really weird term, and I think we should call it something else. And the writer had to say, like, Curtis, that's what it's called. Like, that is and I do wonder, there's a part of me that feels like it was early enough that if I had been a little more aggressive, I could have changed the name. And I was trying to think of, like, on the plane coming here today, I was like, well, what should I have changed it to? And there was nothing like I was sort of torn between, democracy encourager or like Kim Kardashian like butt depictor. Like there's like the good and bad sides of the search engine. But anyway, I think that they did make the right choice, and it was good that I was not the decider in that case. So what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about how I came to write a book of short stories, which I believe, I don't usually say this at events, I believe there are free copies in the first few rows if you want one. And then I'll read a tiny bit to give you a flavor, and then if you have questions, I would be happy to try to answer them, including, I assume that there are probably several people in here who are writing novels and or story collections of their own, so we can talk about that. But so one thing that I'm sort of curious, because I imagine that those of you who are here have different specific jobs, but raise your hand if you have heard that there's like a short story renaissance going on right now. Okay, all right. So like it's, I know, now all of you have, so, because people, this book came out just like a week ago, and I've been doing interviews, and a lot of journalists are saying, like, why are short stories having a moment? And I can't tell who thinks they're having a moment and who does. I mean, that's sort of subjective, but I think that right now, I think there's a couple things going on. There are a few people who usually write novels who have story collections out. I'm one of those people. I've written 5 novels, and this is my first story collection. Someone else is like Lionel Shriver has a story collection out right now. Someone named Joseph O'Neill has a story collection coming out. There's definitely lots of like buzzy books. There's someone named, I think you could say his name, Jamel Brinkley, who had a book just come out yesterday that's this super buzzy story collection. So And then there was a story in the New Yorker in December called Cat Person. Okay, one more, like this, I won't keep doing this, but raise your hand if you have heard of Cat Person. That's so interesting. So this story got a ton of attention, and I loved it. It's a wonderful story, but it definitely transcended. I have 3 siblings, none of them are writers, and they all said to me, like, we need to talk about Cat Person. Like, I don't even think they read a story in the New Yorker from one year to the next, and we had to like process our emotions about Cat Person all together. It's a sort of, it's not about the Me Too movement, but it kind of touches on issues from that. And so it was very timely, and it had this very striking photo accompanying it. But in terms of whether there is a short story renaissance going on, like, I feel like great if there is. I mean, I think that people are always writing short stories, and sometimes the larger culture pays attention and sometimes it doesn't. But people who love short stories, I think, would maybe push back against this idea. But then at the same time, it's true, like, undeniably, we all have slightly shrinking attention spans. Maybe some of you are partially responsible for that, which could be like a point of pride. Congratulations. And on the one hand, I think that if you can find like the right novel and absorb yourself into it, it's like a wonderful experience, especially now. But at the same time, if you are going to bed and maybe you want to do something other than look at a screen in those last 20 minutes. Reading a short story can be this wonderful experience, and it can feel maybe more manageable than starting a 700-page novel or a 400-page novel or something like that. So the way that I came to write this story collection is basically, I was one of those people who, from childhood, from the time that I knew how to read and write, I loved reading stories. I loved writing stories. I ended up going to graduate school at the Iowa Writers Workshop. I basically jumped over like 20 years. And I think a lot of times people fiction writers think of stories as sort of their apprenticeship while they're learning to write a novel or moving toward writing a novel. And in some ways that was what happened to me, in the sense that my first book came out in 2005, and at that point I was offered additional contracts for novels, which I love novels, like I was really excited, but I sort of got away from writing stories. And I think that they're not really an apprenticeship. They are their own sort of beautiful form, but I personally kind of got on this other path. And so I wrote, after my first one, I wrote 4 more novels. There's maybe a period of like 12 years where I was writing novels, and there would be some situation, or I might think of like, oh, that could be a first line for a story. But during those years, I was busy. I had 2 children. I wrote more novels. I was always sort of on deadline, and so I didn't really do it. And then in the spring of 2016, I had just had a novel come out. I had been going around. I live in St. Louis, Missouri, but I had been going around to different events in different cities, and which was sort of churning me up a little bit. Like the normal life of a writer, at least for me, is very quiet, and I'm mostly at home by myself. And it's sort of the opposite of traveling and interacting with other humans. And so I thought to kind of like re-immerse myself in writing and in being more inwardly focused, instead of writing another novel, like either going back to a novel that was in progress that was a huge mess, so it was off-putting, or starting a new novel, which was very daunting in its own way, I thought, I'm going to write a short story. And I had, in the last 12 years, a couple times I had been commissioned by editors, including, most recently, an editor at Esquire had reached out to me and said, we want you to write a story from the perspective of Hillary Clinton on the eve of her official presidential nomination at the Democratic Convention. So again, this is in early 2016. I write the story. So I had a little hesitation because I said, well, what if it ends up that she's not the front runner and Bernie Sanders is? So there was some like confusion and doubt I had about the 2016 election, but it was completely the wrong confusion and doubt. So I wrote that story. Again, it came out even before the actual convention had occurred. And something that's very interesting to me as a writer and a reader is I was in London last week, and I did an event where they asked me to read the story in its entirety. And of course, with almost maybe like 4 words in it are different now. It's a completely different story than it was when I wrote it. And so, and I feel that as a person, that if I read a story, you know, like my favorite writer is the Canadian writer Alice Munro, and if I read a story of hers when I was 20 and I now read it, I might have loved it back then, but now that, you know, I've gotten married or I've had children or I've just like gotten 2 decades older, I can sort of see it in a totally different light. So it is an interesting thing. And a couple of these stories, they're not exactly about Donald Trump, but they sort of touch, that's like the backdrop for some of the characters interacting. The book starts with a man and woman interacting in the summer of 2015, and it's a female professor and a male airport shuttle driver, and he's a Trump supporter sharing his unsolicited political views, and she's sort of impatiently listening. But then she loses her driver's license and must contact him later. So they end up having, you know, a longer conversation. And that's the story that opens. And then the story that closes the book is there's 2 people who went to boarding school together, who 25 years ago, who were a man and woman, or at the time a boy and girl, who ran in a student government election against each other. And the results were sort of murky. And after the 2016 election, the woman reaches out to the man and says, I'm going to be in Chicago where he lives. Would you like to have dinner? And he thinks she's coming to kind of reconcile this thing that happened. She actually has a completely different agenda that I'll let you discover for yourself if you'd like to read the story. But so it's sort of, again, that issue of an experience in life. The experience can stay the same or sort of be, you know, preserved in amber, but because we change, our perspective on it changes, which is a very, very interesting thing for me to think about. And I feel like, again, insofar as we're having a short story renaissance, I think that usually I don't think it's fiction's job to capture the zeitgeist or you know, to be timely or make political commentary. That's more like opinion pieces do that, or essays. But the reality is that a story can be written in a few weeks. I mean, there are some people who are superhuman who can actually write a novel in a few weeks. I'm not one of them. So a story can, I think, contain the current moment more than a novel can. And it can also contain a certain energy where a story hinges on a moment instead of covering a much longer sort of section of time. Okay, I'm gonna give you a little flavor. So this is the story. The story itself, it's the second story in the book, and it's called The World Has Many Butterflies. It actually gives the book its title, even though no story in the whole book has that exact title, but it becomes, I think, pretty self-explanatory. And also, if you are holding a book, there's a few sentences that I don't read because I've realized the hard way they're like too awkward to say those sentences into a microphone. But you can, so if you think like, did she skip them? Yes, I did skip them on purpose. Julie and Graham had known each other for 8 years before they ever played I'll Think It, You Say It. Then they played I'll Think It, You Say It for a year before Julie decided, realized, idiotically fabricated the belief that she was in love with Graham. Graham worked at the same investment banking firm in Houston as Julie's husband. Also, their respective kids all attended the same private school, which meant Julie and Keith saw Graham and his wife Gail regularly in a way that for almost a decade had barely registered with Julie. They showed up at the same soccer games and school fundraisers and Christmas parties and dinner parties. They greeted one another in a friendly fashion, and in retrospect, Julie went over it repeatedly, that innocent earlier era before she became obsessed. She thought of Graham as slightly more appealing than most men, but neither fascinating nor smolderingly handsome. Even later, Julie considered Graham and Keith comparably attractive if your thing was preppy middle-aged men, which hers apparently was. It was at Brett and Tracy Hutchinson's 20th anniversary party at River Oaks Country Club that Graham appeared beside Julie and said for the first time, I'll think it, you say it. Julie was standing alone momentarily because the babysitter had texted to ask if her youngest child was allowed to go to sleep with the light on in his room. Graham nodded his head once toward an unofficial receiving line that had formed around the party's hosts. Well, for starters, Julie said, I'm surprised they decided to throw this party because I was always under the impression Brett and Tracy kind of hate each other. She glanced at Graham before adding, I assume they're celebrating, a total of 3 happy years together? Graham raised his eyebrows. I'd have estimated 1, but sure, let's round up. And even though they're both tedious, they're tedious in such distinctive ways, Julie said. With him, it's like all roads eventually lead to a disquisition on the pleasures of hunting white-tailed deer. But apart from being bloodthirsty, he's really gentle and has such good manners. Whereas with her, all roads lead to her gifted children, and she's so aggressive and braggy. Literally, she's probably told me 12 times that Mr. Vaughn said Fritz is the most talented math student he's ever had. Julie took a sip of her champagne before adding, to be fair, Tracy does look great tonight. Her Spanx must be killing her, but she looks great. What are Spanx? Graham asked. Seriously, they're shapewear. Julie made air quotes. They smooth out your womanly lumps and bumps. And here I thought womanly lumps and bumps were one of life's great gifts, Graham said, depending on the location. When Julie and Graham's eyes met, she said, who else? That's the game they play. And obviously, the game is called I'll Think It, You Say It. And a friend of mine, a writer friend named Emily, read that story. And she said, well, the interesting thing is, in some ways, Curtis, that's what you're writing, that your writing sort of says the thing that the people are thinking, but probably wouldn't express because it's too rude and uncomfortable, which of course I took as a huge compliment. And so I thought, oh, you've given me my title, and to be fair, she is one of the 3 people to whom the entire story collection is dedicated. And actually, another one is a friend of mine. And the rest of the story is fictitious, but this friend of mine was at a party, and my friend is very witty, and a man came up to her and said, I'll think it, you say it. And they did not proceed to get sort of emotionally entangled with each other as the characters did in the story, but I thought, oh my God, that's like such a juicy premise for a story. And I will say, I asked my friend permission if I could steal it from her life, and when she said yes, I also dedicated the book to her too. So, all right, if you have any questions about writing, Stanford in 1997, agents, creativity, cat person, yes.
I have a question. You just mentioned that you showed your friend that story and you went to the Iowa Writers Workshop. I mean, do you feel like you still really work in a workshop format where like either chapter by chapter or story by story, you really like look for that feedback from people that you trust?
Yes, the short answer is definitely yes. So I don't know if you all are familiar with MFA programs in creative writing, but essentially the way that they work is, I mean, it's funny because unlike, say, getting a law degree or getting a degree in other more scientific fields, there's no guarantee that you're qualified for really anything upon graduating, but during the time you're there, you've received this gift of time. And you've also, under ideal circumstances, you've found other people who can read your work and give you like hopefully honest and helpful feedback. And the sort of beautiful thing is to find like a kindred spirit in writing sensibility. Your writing doesn't really have to be very similar. You just have to, it's almost like you and the other person, and ideally it's a two-way street, are both trying to help each other make your writing be the best version of what it is, instead of trying to change each other's writing and making it sort of conform more to your own personal taste. And so the format of a workshop is, you turn in a story, like say a 20-page story, and I'm trying to remember, like I think we used to turn them in on a Thursday. And then they, in the olden days of the late 90s, they would get Xeroxed, put on a shelf, people would pick them up, and then on Tuesday, you'd be in a class, sitting around a square or rectangular table, and let's say you had 8 classmates. You would sit there silently, and it's considered a violation of protocol to speak, let alone to try to defend your story. And these other 8 people would discuss your story for like maybe 40 or 45 minutes. And then they would turn to you, or the professor would turn to you and say, do you have any questions? And probably like in minute 14, you had a lot to say, and then by minute 40, you've been like crushed, and like you just want to go get under a blanket, and then you say, no, thank you so much for all your feedback, and then you probably ignore what like 5 of the people say, and maybe you feel like sad and bitter for a few weeks, and then you realize that the other 3 people had incredibly wise, insightful feedback, and you change your story and it becomes much better, and like that's what it is to be a writer. And so yes, I feel like I'm kind of proud or like too proud to show my writing when it's in a super messy state. Like some people might give you an 80-page manuscript. They might give it to a friend, and it'll, like one thing will be like, this scene will be here, and I feel like write the scene, because you can't evaluate something based on an idea. It has to be the execution. So I'll show a first draft to sort of like my inner circle, and there are some people, like I will say occasionally I'll think, ooh, I need like a straight man to read this, because there are 2 straight male protagonists, and there aren't that many straight men in my life besides the one I'm married to. So I feel like sometimes I do have to purposely, or I one time wrote a novel that was about a woman born in the 40s in Wisconsin, and so I did have several women born in the 40s in Wisconsin read a rough draft of the novel, and they could say, well, we didn't grow soybeans back in the 50s or whatever. So I try to kind of like foolproof it like that. But for me, it's very important to get feedback. Other questions or comments?
Recently rereading some of George Orwell's letters and essays and whatnot, and he points out, it's probably in the 30s or something like that, that he was talking to people who didn't really like short stories because the effort of getting into new characters and whatnot, you have to do this every dozen pages as opposed to investing once in a book, and I suppose the alternative is some sort of hybrid form, like Oliver Kittredge, which is kind of a novel in story format. Do you try to link stories, or are they all really independent?
So the stories in my book are independent. There's also, I guess, the novella, which could be some kind of compromise. But I feel as if my stories are not literally linked, but they are thematically linked. And that was almost a conscious decision I made, where I one time interviewed a writer, Antonia Nelson, who primarily writes short stories. This was years ago, like at least 15 years ago. And she said she had a professor, a writing professor, who said, you don't have to sort of purposely reveal your obsessions, they will reveal themselves. And I think that's true. I when I was arranging the stories, it was almost like a mixtape. For those who remember mixtapes, where I thought, like, these stories echo each other, and so I do want them next to each other, or these stories echo each other, and I don't want them next to each other. And some of the themes that arose were, the passage of time and the hold that high school can have on you and your identity. And then another theme was marriage, and then another theme was like a woman who semi-irrationally hates another woman with whom she interacts, who she doesn't know that well. There's also sort of fame and social media and public identity, and so I did think, like, sometimes there will be a story collection, and it's almost like, and I feel like it's, writers should do whatever they want, but it seems like someone will be almost showing their range as a writer for the sake of showing their range, and it's like, this story is set 200 years ago, and like this is science fiction, and I think like that's one approach, and I sort of went in the opposite direction, where I don't think if you read any one of these stories, I don't think you would be surprised if someone said, this other story is by the same author. They have a sort of fixed perspective or consistent perspective. But you're right. The thing that you're saying, the truth is that I think a lot of people in publishing who tend to be passionate readers, they themselves love stories and love story collections, but story collections do tend to sell a lot less than novels. And I think it's often for the reason that you're saying, where somebody feels like, I just sort of got acquainted with who's who, and I got invested, and now it's over. But at the same time, I think there's a trade-off to everything, and there can be a sort of excitement or energy. Like, the truth is, I think most novels, like if a novel's 300 pages, there's probably 15 pages here or there that like could have been cut, could have stayed in, who cares? But like in a novel, there shouldn't be, in a story, there should not be 15 pages that are like take them or leave them either way. Like everything should feel more central.
One more related question. I read the British magazine Granta, which has a lot of stories. It's shorter form stuff. But then when I read the notes at the back, I realize that, or I see that a lot of those quote unquote stories are actually chapters, from a book in progress. And so they seem, pretty standalone. So, I mean, do you think of novels that way, that you can sort of extract chapters, or they're kind of made out of independent pieces?
It probably depends on the novel, and it might depend on how motivated the editor who's doing the extracting, like the magazine editor is. I'll tell you the truth is, so for about 20 years, I submitted, off and on, I submitted stories to the New Yorker, and the New Yorker would always say, no thank you. And then in summer of 2016, they finally said, yes, okay, we'll take it. And it's the first story in here, gender studies, and I think that acceptance encouraged me actually to keep writing stories. But during the time that the New Yorker, during that 2-decade span while the New Yorker was not accepting work from me, my agents had submitted my novels in their entirety to say, would you like an excerpt? And they would say like, no thanks, but best of luck. So I mean, I think that there are, like, I remember the novel that just won the Pulitzer Prize, Less by Andrew Sean Greer. That was excerpted. It was like there was a short story in the New Yorker, and actually another one, The Idiot by a woman. I need to learn to pronounce her name. It's Elif, like Elif. Do you know Batuman? Do any of you know how to pronounce that? Anyway, she wrote a book called The Idiot. It's great. That too was excerpted in the New Yorker. And sometimes I read something and I think it is a short story, and then I find out it's a novel. And sometimes I can tell that it's a novel. That's it's everything is sort of its own animal and structured differently.
So you'd probably enjoy the New Yorker book of rejected cartoons.
I am surprised to say I don't own it and haven't seen it, but that I feel like I would feel a sense of
the cartoons seem just as good as the accepted ones to me.
Wow, it's a very there's like a lot of, I mean, I'm sure some of you read the New Yorker, that back page, like sometimes I'll think, all three of these are equally hilarious. They all deserve to be.
So I read Prep when it came out, as in I know a couple other people did as well here. And I've always wanted to know, I went to a boarding school in Massachusetts. Has it ever been revealed what the school you created, the fictional school after, was?
So my first novel, Prep, was set at a Massachusetts boarding school, which of course is a funny thing. Again, I live in St. Louis, and so I would pretty much never be asked that question in St. Louis, but now I'm back in the bosom of the prep school. So in real life, I went to Groton. I graduated in 1993, and I would say that the novel is not autobiographical, but the school, which is called Alt, is Groton in the sense that the biggest parallels are the campus is the Groton campus, so like the buildings and the layout, and some of the like schedule or rituals, or there's something called Surprise Holiday. There's something called Surprise Holiday at Groton. So, I feel like it's not, the things that are described, and that's in a way to be a writer. I think, like I feel at times like to be a fiction writer, that I'm like a bird building a nest, and that I'll sort of take things from wherever I need them. And it's like, this thing that my sister told me 12 years ago, and this thing that's from my imagination, and this thing that I observed, and just kind of mix them together somewhat shamelessly, which I think can be unsettling or confusing to people who are familiar with any part of what is realistic. And so even for my family to read my fiction, I would say, I think it's safe to say my family is supportive, and they're not my ideal audience, because they will, I wrote a novel called Sisterland, and at one point there's a teenage girl who rides a Greyhound bus across several states, and a man sitting next to her asks if she'll pierce his ear. And it's like this total throwaway line. And my older sister said, like, yeah, nice reference to when that guy asked me to pierce his ear in 1989. And I thought to myself, oh, I did steal that from you. Like, it wasn't even conscious or deliberate, or it wasn't like I was trying to send my sister a secret message. It was more like, oh, what's a kind of colorful thing that could happen when one is riding Greyhound? So it's not, I do feel like I did certainly borrow from Groton, and it would be ridiculous to pretend otherwise, but it's not as if I feel like I have some clear view of what I think of Groton, and this is what I want to say about it, because if I did, I would write an essay. I also will say, in this collection, there are 2 stories that are sort of boarding school adjacent, or they're almost like cousins of prep, or sequels to prep, sort of, and there's a part of me that thinks like Curtis, you graduated 25 years ago, like, get over it. And then there's another part of me that thinks, oh, but it's so juicy and interesting. Like, just go with your obsession. So you all can decide if they feel preppish, those of you who've read it.
So I was wondering if since we are in a short story renaissance, do you feel that is something that's being echoed by the publishing houses as well? Or is it still a tough sell to get publishing houses to invest in a short story?
That is a great question that I don't think I know the answer to, and I also don't know. It probably, if there is a short story renaissance, like if, let's say there are, I mean, I'm sure the number is much higher, but let's say there are 10 story collections coming out, from 2 months ago to 4 months from now. I'm sure there are probably like 500 story collections coming out during that time. It probably depends, honestly, in part, how they sell. Because, I mean, it's like, think about, I'm sure that some of you read Gone Girl. Like, in some ways, Gone Girl, I think, prompted the publication of some similar books. Or, if something is successful, people in publishing will think, maybe there's more of an appetite for this. And I'm not at all disdainful of that. Like, publishing is a business. It's not for hobbyists. I mean, it tends to be populated by people who love to read. But it'll be interesting to see that. I mean, I think also, again, like, book clubs don't pick story collections as much to read, and book clubs can be really influential and determining, So we can meet back here in 6 months and assess the situation.
So did you write them all sequentially? Did you have a plan going into it? You said, I just read Fresh Complaint by Jeffrey Eugenides, and that seemed like it was a hodgepodge of the last 20 years.
Yeah.
It was good.
So what I did actually was, after I had assembled enough stories that I felt like, okay, this could be a collection. First I had to kind of check in with my publisher, because I wasn't completely certain that they would want to publish a collection, and I was delighted when they did. And then it was actually a high priority for them. Like, and it's certainly, I wish that my professional problem was like, every time I submit a story to the New Yorker, it gets in. That's like not my professional problem. But my publisher did say, stop submitting to the New Yorker. Like, if we're going to publish this collection, we do not want any more of the stories to already have been published and be accessible. And we want people to feel like they're getting something new and fresh in the book. And so half the stories have never been published anywhere, and half the stories have been. And so 3 of them were published in the past, and then 7 of them I wrote in this. There was this sort of wave of my own personal short story renaissance, when I knew that I was going to have a collection, I actually printed them all out and like put them on the floor of my office, and physically was kind of moving them around and thinking, in terms of time, in the, like, what time period, what year is it in the story, what themes does it have, how old is the protagonist, how will these echo each other, and the story that I mentioned that I wrote for Esquire about Hillary Clinton, at one point that was the starting story, but it was really written like, almost like, here I am in the Wells Fargo about to give this speech or whatever. Like, it was really a first person thing from her point of view. And so it felt different, and I think my publisher felt like it felt a little confusing because, as it happens, I'm writing a novel from the perspective of Hillary Clinton. To my own surprise, so it's the premise of it is, if Hillary Clinton, in real life, obviously, she went to Yale Law School, she met and fell in love with Bill Clinton. Well, she was Hillary Rodham at the time. And then also in real life, he proposed to her multiple times before she accepted. And so my premise is, what if all that happened, but she ultimately declined his proposals and sort of went on her own way? And because if you are somebody who follows writerly gossip, which I assume you all do, like that news is out there that I'm writing this, and so I think they thought this will be confusing, and then that kind of redistributed things, but you know, I don't. It's hard to say. Like, it's almost like, I think, if you like naming a child or something, where like sometimes you'll maybe 7 years later you'll think, should I have given my child a different name? And it's like, should these be in a completely different order? Like, you know, maybe they should, maybe they shouldn't, but yeah, it is what it is at a certain point.
I had a question, actually. So I found it really interesting that about half the short stories in the collection were told in the third person, and about half were in the first person. And I was interested in like your thought process about when you choose to write from a first-person perspective versus a third-person perspective. If that's something that you're very consciously thinking about when you start writing, or if it just sort of evolves more naturally.
I think it's much more intuitive, actually, and I think that very rarely I have changed it, like started in one direction and gone in another. But I think like the way I feel about a lot of creative writing decisions is that it's almost like getting dressed in the morning, where if I said to any of you, like, why are you wearing the shirt that you're wearing? And you'd probably say, well, I put it on and it was fine, so I kept it on. Or you would say, well, I put something else on and it felt weird, and so, or like I noticed it had a stain on it, or so I changed. So it's more like, I mean, I definitely revise a lot, but I think that I just sort of go, you have to just, with writing, you have to just try it and put it down there and, you know, like see how it works. And then sometimes you have to do it that way to see how not right it is, and then but you can kind of know how to fix it. But I think that it is one of my favorite comments about writing fiction. So again, I went to graduate school, and the director of the Iowa Writers Workshop at that point was a man named Frank Conroy, and he would say, writing fiction is this combination of knowing what you're doing and not knowing what you're doing. And I love that, because I do think, I mean, it's not like I don't like when people kind of pretend like fairies landed on my shoulder and like whispered in my ear, but I also think there is this weird kind of ineffable quality to writing fiction, and that fiction kind of synthesizes different elements of life that you can't kind of replicate outside of fiction. Like, that's why fiction has to exist. Thank you all so much for coming.